It only takes 1 week for everything to change. As we enter week 2 of the fantasy football season, I'm taking you through all of my favorite starts and sits on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. I hope you started the season off for a win, but if you didn't, it's time to turn that all around as we head into week 2 starts and sits. If you haven't already, it'll be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. You can check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. That's where I release all of the graphics, my rankings, and answer your start sit questions. You can, of course, comment below on the video. On Twitter, I'm at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can find my full rankings over there, and I write my articles over at football.rasball.com. But let's get into today's content. We're talking about starts and sits. So I'm basically taking you through my full rankings for this week. Last week on Fantasy Pros, I was ranked sixth. Oh, can barely say that. Sixth in accuracy. Australians should not say that word. I was ranked in the position number 6 in accuracy on Fantasy Pros last week, out of about 200 ranks, which is a good start to the season. I was 3rd overall, of course, a couple of years ago, 7th last year, so trying to keep it in the top 10 again this year. And we're starting off with the quarterbacks, and if you've forgotten, basically, anyone in green has a particularly good matchup, meaning they're going to be ranked higher than they usually would be. Anyone in red has a worse matchup, which means they're going to be ranked a little bit lower. And there's no major surprises here in the top 10. Most of these guys are guys you're going to start anyway. Kyler Murray's a little bit higher than he usually would be, but realistically, if you've got Kyler, he's probably your number 1 quarterback and you're going to start him. Jaden Daniels perhaps a little bit of a surprise, but I think we've seen with his rushing floor that he's a pretty safe option. And there's a lot of players obviously either injured or just not going to happen this week, so Daniels slides up a bit naturally. Tua obviously very disappointing in that game. Didn't play well, got injured. He's not going to be ranked anywhere near there for the near future. Probably won't be ranked at all for the next few weeks. But Baker Mayfield is the real surprise. I had him very high last week as well. One of the reasons I was ranked quite high in the accuracy. And I expect he's going to have another big week against Detroit because that's a fantastic matchup. They're very susceptible to quarterbacks throwing the ball. Obviously, they have a very good run-stopping game, so I do expect that Tampa are going to have to throw a lot and early in what's probably going to be a shootout. And because it's going to be a shootout, that means that Jared Goff's up there as well. They're my 2 favorite streamers. Hopefully, you saw them on my Streamers and Stashes show earlier in the week. They're 2 guys that I think you can definitely start because there's quite a few guys who you probably have who you wouldn't want to be starting this week, like for example, a Brock Purdy. I don't love this matchup. I don't think it's a great situation. Joe Burrow with no T. Higgins. That's a really awkward situation as well. I don't really want to be starting him. Guys like Caleb Williams and Trevor Lawrence were higher up last week, although Caleb Williams wasn't for me. I wanted to see it happen first. They obviously get tough matchups as well. Other guys who are viable streamers this week, or at least viable good options. Matthew Stafford gets another good matchup this week. Justin Fields obviously gets another start. There's a little bit of risk there, obviously, because it's not impossible that something goes wrong. If he's playing poorly, they might just see how Russell Wilson's going. If they think he's fit enough to play, I don't think he is, and therefore that makes Fields okay. But there is at least a little bit of risk. There's always risk with Justin Fields. He didn't even score a touchdown last week, and they still managed to win. So you don't know what's going to happen here. Daniel Jones gets that fantastic matchup against the Commanders. I think he's going to be very productive. But again, he's Daniel Jones. You just don't know. And Kirk Cousins gets a solid matchup. I expected him to be better this season. I knew he was going to be really struggling the first week because of that matchup. I do think he bounces back, but I can't rank him any higher until I see them actually play a little bit better. Other guys like Deshaun Watson and Bryce Young, who are in green there, while they have good matchups, I mean, even in Superflex, you ideally don't want to be starting them. Watson's at least an option. Bryce Young, I can't imagine why you'd be starting him outside very deep leagues. Guys I'm avoiding in Superflex are guys like Herbert, Darnold, and Carr. They all have tough matchups. I'm not excited by the young Malik Willis coming in for Jordan Love. I think he's relatively going to struggle. Let's talk about running backs. Kyren Williams gets a fantastic matchup this week against Arizona. They were the number 1 running back matchup last season, so I expect he's going to have another good game. You absolutely have to start him. You have to start Hall. Saquon and Bijan both get tougher matchups, but I still think you got to start him. And even though Barkley's matchup on paper is tough, I think that he's probably going to get enough work in the passing game, and he's probably got enough touchdown upside that it means that even though it's typically hard to run on Atlanta, I do think that he's going to still do well this week. Joe Mixon gets a fantastic matchup against the Bears. That's basically how you can attack the Bears. Their pass game is pretty strong, but you can attack them on the ground. And Derrick Henry against the Raiders, that's a good matchup for him as well. Jordan Mason gets the Vikings, who are harder to run on, but realistically, San Fran's a little bit matchup proof, so I do think that he's still a solid starting option. And Jahmyr Gibbs, same situation against the Bucs. It's hard to run on them, but they work so many check downs and screens and things like that with Gibbs, and I feel like he's got such high touchdown upside in what should be a shootout that I still have to rank him quite high. Even David Montgomery, even though it's a tough matchup, I still got him ranked quite high because there's that touchdown upside, because I think he's going to get a lot of touches because it's going to be a high-scoring game. Obviously, there's Achane and Cook. I had him ranked higher than most because I expected that to be a good running game, and it was. James Conner gets an awkward matchup against the Rams, but I do feel like he's one of their few weapons in this offense. So even though you should pass the ball on the Rams, I feel like Conner's still going to be productive, and he's got such high touchdown upside. Other guys who are significantly higher this week than usual, Ramondre Stevenson against Seattle. They conceded the most touchdowns to running backs last season, and they improved that a lot last week, but it was a pretty easy matchup last week. This is a lot tougher against the Patriots, and that's not saying very much because the Patriots aren't expected to be fantastic this season. Obviously, they started the season off well, but I do think that game's going to be close enough that Stevenson's going to be heavily involved. Jerome Ford was used way more than we expected. I expected a lot more of Pierre Strong. There were a lot of people that expected Donta Foreman to be used on the goal line. I wasn't one of them. But as it turned out, Ford was just used everywhere. And I think against the Jaguars, and it should be a game that Cleveland's at least close in if they don't win. Look, I think Ford's going to get a lot of touches there. This is going to be a good game for him. Then there's a whole heap of run-heavy backs that have really good matchup. Dobbins against Carolina and Edwards against Carolina. I expect them to both get at least 15 touches. I think they're going to dominate the Panthers, and the Panthers can be best attacked on the ground. Najee Harris against Denver. You can run against Denver. We saw that with Kenneth Walker last week. Brian Robinson Jr. against the Giants. He should be good. And Pollard against the Jets. They're two teams that you can attack on the ground as well. Obviously, the number one running backs for those teams are the guys you want. On the other hand, Travis Etienne Jr., he got 12 rushes. He also got a couple of receptions and a touchdown. But he got 12 rushes. So did Tank Bigsby. Now, I'm not saying that they're totally splitting work, but that's enough to make me very nervous. And then he takes on the Browns, who's just a general tough matchup. Don't feel great about him this week, so I'm dropping him a little bit. I'm still starting him ahead of most of those streamers, but it's a lot closer than it normally would be. And Rashad White against the Lions, I mean, you ideally don't want to start running backs against the Lions, especially when White was nowhere near as good as Bucky Irving, and it is possible that he'll take some touches away this week. So they're two guys I feel nervous about. Also, Aaron Jones against the 49ers. It's hard to feel good about anybody against the 49ers, and Jones is splitting touches with Ty Chandler, so that's an awkward situation as well. I'm kind of avoiding those guys if possible. On the lower half, a few tough matchups around here. Guys like Zeke and Dowdle against Saints. That's not the toughest matchup, but just enough to be awkward. That means I can't have them any higher. But Zeke's got such good receiving and goal line upside that I do still think he's an option in your flex. Zamir White against Baltimore is interesting because I've got White in red and Madison in green. Essentially, I think the way that backfield's going to work is in games that the Raiders are winning, I think you're going to see a lot of White on the ground. In games where they're behind, I think you're going to see the receiving back Madison heavily involved. And we saw that last week against the Chargers. It should have been a good White game, but instead it was Madison getting a lot of early down carries because they just didn't want to take him off. And so essentially in a game against Baltimore that we expect him to be losing, Madison becomes a guy who becomes viable. This is half PPR rankings. In PPR, Madison's even higher for me. Tyjae Spears, again, should be good against the Jets, but I feel like this is going to be more of a Pollard game. Same thing with Warren against Denver. I also just need to see Jalen Warren be healthy and get back to getting a normal amount of touches. There's a whole heap of low-end guys who have matchups of different types. You're not really thinking about starting most of these guys. I know Justice Hill will be tempting. Some people have picked him off waivers. You shouldn't have. That didn't make any sense. He's the receiving back there, and this is not a good matchup for him. Same thing with Emmanuel Wilson. He's the receiving back. So even though he's going to have a solid game against the Colts, who you can run against, Josh Jacobs is obviously a little bit injured. I do ultimately think he's not someone you want to start. He also drops a lot if Marshall Lloyd does end up playing, though I do think Lloyd will be limited as well. Get into the wide receivers. And I mean, those top six you're starting. You start in the top six unless you somehow have four of them, in which case you don't need my help. Your team's amazing. Debo, Mike Evans, and Rashee Rice all get excellent matchups. I had Mike Evans as a top 4 wide receiver last week, and he scored 2 touchdowns. That was always going to be a great matchup against the Commanders. And he gets another fantastic matchup against the Lions, who've been very susceptible all over the field for a while now. Their secondary just isn't their strength. They're such a good run-stopping team. I do think Evans and Godwin both have fantastic games. Debo Samuel's higher than usual, not because the Vikings is a great matchup, although it's a good matchup, but because he's essentially their second running back. They move him into the backfield and give him plenty of carries, and that's just an excellent way to get some bonus points and also gives him a lot of extra touchdown upside. It's not easy to run on the Vikings, but I do feel like this extra touches kind of help elevate him a little bit above where he would be. Rice gets a solid matchup against the Bengals. I don't think you particularly want Chase against the Chiefs, but you have to start him if you have Jamar Chase. They just don't have anything else at the moment. T. Higgins is not healthy. Yoshavas has actually got the better matchup. You actually want the slot guy against the Chiefs, but it wouldn't surprise me if they find ways to get Chase in the slot, and therefore he's still a guy that you have to start for me, even though he's got that bad matchup. A little bit further down, same situation with Garrett Wilson. It seems like the Titans are looking a lot better this season. We kind of expected that with Ladarius Sneed, although he doesn't really travel so much with the number 1 guy. He kind of stays on the same side of the field most of the time, so Wilson can get away from him. If anything, I think that means it's going to be a worse situation for your Allen Lazard. And of course, Mike Williams coming back is going to hurt that as well. If you pick Lazard up off waivers, that was probably a mistake. Wilson's someone you've still got to start. But you just slightly lower expectations on him. A couple of solid matchups there in Malik Neighbors and Drake London. They both disappointed in their games last week, but they get excellent matchups against Washington and Philly. If they're going to get right, it's going to be this week. I have to start both of those guys because we've only seen 1 week of them. We can't trust what we see in 1 week. We have to expect them to be better than that. Chris Godwin gets another great matchup against Detroit. You can attack them through the slot. Even though they cycled through the slot, Godwin is the main slot guy. But realistically, you can just attack the Lions in general with their secondary. So Godwin should have a good game. Evans should have a good game. Don't be surprised if Mick Millen has a good game as well. Amari Cooper gets the Jaguars. I think he's going to be the number 1 option in that offense this week. He and Jerome Ford. So he's someone they definitely want to be starting. I know a lot of people were disappointed by him last week. That's why I've got him a little bit lower, not because people were disappointed, but because the passing game was just terrible in general. I think that was mainly the Cowboys factor, and they just generally played poorly. I do think they have better in them. It wouldn't surprise me if they bounce back. Jamison Williams higher than I expected to put him, but he's taking on Tampa Bay. They're going to have to throw the ball. That's probably going to be a shootout, big touchdown upside. That's why I've ranked him higher there. And Xavier Worthy, I just like his touchdown upside. There's a whole heap of guys who are kind of average after about 28 downwards. It's kind of hard. There's no one that I feel particularly good about from that point onwards. Guys with bad matchups. Chris Olave was disappointing last week, but they didn't need to use him. So I understand why they didn't. They might need to use him against the Cowboys. So even though it's a tough matchup, I do kind of feel like he's a viable guy that you can start still. So that's why he still cracks my top 24. Devontae Adams gets that tough matchup against the Ravens. I think they will struggle. The Ravens might try to shut him down. So that's going to be awkward. But we have seen with Rashee Rice last week, for example, you can still have success against the Ravens if you're in the right situation. Michael Pittman Jr., I think they're probably going to find a lot of success on the ground against the Packers in what could be a short game. We saw the Colts only played 45 snaps last week, and they still managed to get a good result. I do feel like they're going to want to try to compress the game, and the Packers probably do the same thing because they've got Malik Willis, so that could be a pretty ugly game. I don't particularly want Pittman, especially with Anthony Richardson as the quarterback, until I see him actually be able to function well in that offense. DK Metcalf gets a tricky matchup against the Patriots, plus he's just been a little bit questionable with injury issues, so that kind of eases me back on him a little bit. And Flowers against the Raiders, they need to throw to him. They're really targeting their tight ends around the red zone as well. I feel like his upside's limited, even though he's probably got a good floor, especially in PPR. It'd be a little bit higher than this. Low-end wide receivers, not many great positive options here. Even someone like Keenan Allen battling injury. I know that Rome Odunze's out, but it's hard to trust Allen unless we actually know he's healthy. So you want to keep your ear to the ground and find out what's going on here. He plays a little bit later. Terry McLaurin, I didn't like him coming into the season. He gets a better matchup against the Giants, but with Jaden Daniels, I just don't think this is really going to be a situation where he's going to get enough of the ball for it to work. I think we're going to see a lot of the run game. I think we're going to see Daniels scrambling. I think we're going to see check downs. I know that Daniels throws a nice deep ball, but very conservative. McLaurin's not good enough to get really open consistently. I feel like this is going to be a long season for him, but this is one of his better matchups. Wan'Dale Robinson is one of my favorite streamers this week. I've got him pretty high, and I've got him even higher in PPR. It's against Washington. He had 12 targets last week, and he gets a better matchup this week, which is insane. He's going to be very, very busy if the game script goes the same way. Dano Moody also gets a great matchup for Atlanta. I do feel like he's a deep streamer that you can consider. Guys that you want to consider avoiding for a number of reasons. George Pickens gets Denver. That's Patrick Surtain. He's very capable of shutting down players. So I would expect that he's going to have a harder game. We saw what happened last week with DK Metcalf. Admittedly, Metcalf played pretty well. Still got a couple of flags on Surtain, but Surtain is one of the best quarterbacks in the league. He does work as a shutdown corner, so I do think that Pickens is going to have a tough week. Not that they have many other passing options, but I think they still struggle to get the ball to him. All of the Jaguars, that's Kirk and Thomas and Gabe Davis, who didn't even crack the top 50 against Cleveland. Really hard to pass on Cleveland. We saw that the Cowboys just plain didn't need to. I expect this week that the Jaguars struggle to move the ball. That really limits Kirk. He's not even getting enough snaps at the moment. He's getting the third most snaps. Working from the slot, which is the better option against Cleveland, which is why I've got him ranked high, but I'm avoiding him. I'm avoiding Brian Thomas Jr., and I'm always avoiding Gabe Davis. Jaden Reed and all of the other Packers receivers I'm also low on because we don't know what to expect from Malik Willis. The Colts actually not a bad matchup. It's not a great matchup, but it's not bad. I can't trust that situation with Willis. Lad McConkey against the Panthers. That might sound weird because it's like they're the Panthers. They're awful. They are awful against the run. They're actually really good against slot receivers. Don't really know why. It's not like their secondary has their best player in the slot. They kind of move JC Horn outside mostly. So I'm not really sure why it works out that way. They just seem to be very effective with their scheme against slot receivers. That kind of hurts Lad McConkey unless he gets moved outside more because of the injuries we've seen. DJ Chark's on IR. Joshua Palmer might miss out. That means it's going to be McConkey and Quinton Johnston and someone. I don't honestly know who. Brendan Rice maybe comes in and plays outside, even though he's inactive last week. Darius Davis is more of like a special teams guy. Semi Fahoku is a slot guy, so it's not impossible they move McConkey outside. He did play outside a lot in college, but when you've got a rookie playing his second game, you don't really want to be shifting him around a heap. So I think McConkey probably sticks in the slot, but because of that uncertainty and the lack of other players there, he is still an option. Calvin Ridley is, again, the number one option, but against the Jets, it's so hard to throw on the Jets. They're such elite cornerbacks. Don't want him or DeAndre Hopkins, who didn't even make the top 50 because of his injury issues. I don't really want either of the Seattle wide receivers. I talked about that earlier as well. Let's talk about tight ends. No surprises here. I mean, look, Kyle Pitts is probably higher than most people expect. That's because he's essentially a wide receiver. Taking on the Eagles, who are obviously very poor against wide receivers. So for that reason, I've got him a little bit higher than you might expect. But everyone's basically where you'd expect, except Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely. Obviously, Likely blew up last week. I don't think we actually have evidence to suggest that's necessarily going to happen again. Andrews still ran more routes and was still involved the amount we'd expect from a route participation perspective. It's just that Likely was heavily involved as well because they used a lot of 12 personnel. I do think this week they're going to be more ready for Likely, the Raiders will, and therefore we could see a situation where Andrews has a bounce back. I've ranked Andrew higher because I just don't necessarily know that Likely's actually going to be that number one guy. Although realistically, it's hard to feel particularly good about most tight ends because tight end was real ugly last week. I think that probably bounces back a bit. On the other side of this game, you of course have Brock Bowers, who was good last week. Hard to know against Baltimore what's going to happen. They are hard to pass on in general. And Evan Ingram against Cleveland, as I've said before, kind of hard to play against the Browns. I think in PPI is a bit higher, but he does lack that touchdown upside. For some reason, they just don't pass to him in the red zone, even though he's such a big-bodied player. So for that reason, Ingram's a little bit lower, but he's still a starter. A couple of viable options on the edge of the top 12 here. Dallas Goedert against the Falcons. That's actually not a bad matchup for tight ends, but the better matchups, Colby Parkinson against the Cardinals. I think that he's going to get a lot of routes. He was running, 40-odd routes last week. Routes are good for tight ends. You don't want them in there blocking. You want them out there running, capable of catching passes each week. Parkinson is doing that more than most. With Puka Nacua out, he could viably turn himself into the second option, although I do think he's still fighting it out with Demarcus Robinson and Tyler Johnson for those touches. Jordan Akins is a name that no one else has up there. Most of the other accurate rankers have him in the mid-20s. But to me, he's taking over the David Njoku role. It's a good matchup against the Jaguars. he's a viable streamer for me. I will happily start Jordan Akins in some leagues because I like this matchup and I like his situation. Taysom Hill's always a risk, so he slides in there for me. Dalton Schultz gets a tough matchup against the Bears, but he is at least being involved. He also has some injury issues, so it's kind of hard to start him. Pat Frymouth just did not play enough snaps last week, and we saw this coming in the preseason. He takes on Denver, which is actually not the worst matchup, but I just plain don't feel good about starting him this week. Noah Fant gets a tough matchup, but I actually like his participation. Same thing with Zach Ertz. It's hard to feel good about either of those guys. Tucker Kraft's taken over from Luke Musgrave. If you missed that, if you got Musgrave, you can definitely sit him. I just don't know that we can start anyone from the Packers until we know what it looks like with Malik Willis. Tyler Conklin's a bit lower than usual because the Titans are very good against tight ends. But I don't think you're starting Conklin anyway. Same thing with Odden. It's just a situation where they're going to pass to the wide receivers, and everyone below that's not particularly interesting. The only guys I'll highlight, Hayden Hurst clearly seems to be the receiver for the Chargers, and it is possible they score quite a bit against the Panthers. I still think he's a limited option, though. Juwan Johnson's losing a lot of touches to Foster Moreau, which is interesting. He ran less routes than Moreau did, and Moreau was out there for like 50 snaps. Johnson was out there for way less than that, 20-odd. So for that reason, it's really hard to feel good about Johnson. It is possible he bounces back because obviously he's been returning from injury and he slowly makes his way forward. But until that actually happens, I can't start him. Dolchich was more involved than I expected. I thought we'd see a lot more Troutman and a little bit of Lucas Krull. Instead, Krull wasn't even involved. It was Nate Atkins, which was really unexpected. So Dolchich moves up a little bit for me. And Theo Johnson, the clear number one Giants tight end. I did not see that coming either. He takes on Washington, who's actually not bad against tight ends. It's more their wide receivers they're susceptible against because their linebackers are actually pretty solid. No one else there is particularly interesting. And that's all we've got for the Start Sit show for week 2. If you got questions, pop them down in the comments or check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. You can check out my rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. My YouTube obviously is here, and I would love it if you'd like and subscribe because I will be back next week with a waiver wire show, streamers and stashes, and then, of course, the Sit show next week as well. Of course, you can also check out all my stuff at football.rasball.com. They've also got a heap of excellent tools like win-loss ratios and things like that help you understand whether you want players who are home and away and how players perform when they're winning and losing. So you can look at the odds and understand what impact that's going to have on your players. They also have slot versus wide matchups, which tells you if you've got a slot receiver, which matchups are actually better for that style of player, and a whole heap of excellent other stuff as well. So I recommend you check that out too. As for me, though, I will see you guys next week.